I didn't plan on starting my Saturday morning standing on my dock with a sheriff's deputy asking me why there was a golf cart floating nose down 20 feet offshore, but that was how the day ended up beginning. The water was almost perfectly still except for the slow spiral the cart kept doing as it sank a little deeper each minute. The early sun hit the windshield just right, throwing this weird glare across the lake that made everything feel even more surreal. It wasn't my golf cart. Anyone could see that. Mine was parked in my barn like it always was. But the deputy didn't know that yet, and the way he kept glancing between me and the half-submerged cart made me wonder if he thought I'd woken up and decided to fling it into the water out of boredom. I kept my arms folded, partly because it made me look a little less like someone who might vandalize a neighbor's property, and partly because the morning breeze coming off the lake was cooler than I expected. The dock boards under my feet were still damp with dew, and the 3 gulls that always seemed to hang around the cove were perched on the railing like they were judging the whole situation. The deputy asked again, in that calm but slightly suspicious tone they all seemed to practice, if I knew anything about how the golf cart had ended up in the lake. Before I could answer, Karen came marching down her backyard slope like a storm cloud wearing capri pants and a sweatshirt tied around her waist, her blonde hair bouncing with every angry step. She didn't look at me first. She zeroed straight in on the deputy, waving her arm like she was flagging down a taxi. "That's my golf cart," she yelled, though the distance didn't require yelling. She had this way of speaking like everything she said was the most important thing happening in the world, and today seemed no different. The deputy turned to her, which gave me a small break from being the prime suspect. She launched into an explanation before he even asked a question. "I parked it by the dock last night because I didn't want to leave it up by the house," she said, breathing hard from the speedwalk tantrum she'd just performed. "He knows that. Everyone knows that. I told him I needed to use the space next to the dock since our driveway is being resealed." She pointed at me with this dramatic flick of her wrist, the kind people use when they're sure they're right and think their confidence can make a lie true. I could feel the deputy glance toward me again, waiting for some sort of reaction, but I kept my voice even. "I told you yesterday," I said, "that the spot by the dock isn't public. It's on my property. It always has been. And you told me you'd only be there for 5 minutes. Karen rolled her eyes so hard it looked like she was aiming for the back of her head. "I said 5 minutes meaning temporarily," she said. "You knew what I meant." I didn't respond because there was no winning with her logic. In her mind, anything she intended counted more than what she actually said. The deputy held up a hand and told us both to slow down. He asked her when she'd last seen the cart. She said just before sunset. He asked me if I'd touched it or tried to move it. I said no, which was the truth. He wrote something in his little notepad, though I couldn't imagine what exactly. He walked a few steps along the dock and stared at the sinking cart like he was trying to piece together a puzzle missing half the pieces. The lake was clear enough that you could see the tires underwater, making the cart look like a strange sea creature that didn't belong there. "So," the deputy finally said, "you found the cart here this morning?" I nodded. "Around 6. I came down to open the kayak shed and saw it bobbing out there." "And you didn't hear anything last night?" "No," I said. "If someone pushed it in, they did it quietly. Or late." Karen exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. "Nobody pushed it in," she said. "It must have rolled. The ground slopes." "He knows it slopes." "The ground slopes away from the water," I said, trying not to sound irritated. Karen gave me a look that could cut metal. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying physics exists," I said, and I immediately regretted it because sarcasm never helps with her. The deputy closed his notebook and sighed in a way that suggested he wanted to be anywhere but here. "Ma'am, property disputes should usually go through the HOA or civil channels," he said. "Right now my concern is whether there's any criminal issue like vandalism or negligence." Karen shook her head, pacing a bit. "It didn't roll itself in," she muttered, but then she said it loud enough for him to hear. He's always had a problem with me parking near the dock. It's my dock, I said again, but this time I sounded defensive even to myself. The deputy took a moment, then asked if either of us wanted to file a report. Karen snapped, "Yes, of course I want to file a report. Someone destroyed my property." I rubbed my forehead. "Destroyed seems like a strong word," I said quietly. She shot me this look like I had personally driven her golf cart into the lake at full speed. The deputy said we'd handle the report up by his truck, so we all started walking back toward the shore. The wet grass clung to my shoes, and the air smelled like that mix of clay and lake water that always hits right after sunrise. Karen walked ahead, muttering under her breath. Something about boundaries. Something about me thinking I own everything. Something about how neighbors used to respect each other before certain people moved in. I assumed I was one of the certain people, even though I'd lived there longer than she had. The deputy hung back with me for a moment before we reached his truck. "Has this been an ongoing thing?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "She thinks the entire shoreline is some kind of shared amenity," I said. "She keeps parking things here. Her kayak, her paddleboard, now her golf cart. I asked her nicely a couple times to keep her stuff on her own property. She took it personally." The deputy nodded in that tired, understanding way cops do when they've already guessed most of the story. He said something like he'd seen worse neighbor fights over smaller things. I said I wasn't trying to fight, which was true. Living next to water already came with enough maintenance headache. I didn't need extra ones delivered by golf cart. By the time we got to his truck, Karen was already planted beside the tailgate like she was giving a press conference. She launched into her statement before he pulled out his pen. She said she believed someone intentionally pushed her cart in. She didn't want to directly accuse me, but she made it clear she didn't think anyone else had a motive. She talked about patterns of hostility, which was a dramatic way of describing me asking her to stop blocking my dock every couple weeks. When it was my turn, the deputy asked me to walk him through my morning again. I kept it simple. I'd gone down to grab a life jacket from the shed. I'd seen the cart drifting. I didn't touch it. Didn't move anything. Didn't call anyone because I figured at first maybe it wasn't as serious as it looked. The deputy wrote it all down. He then asked the question I had been hoping he wouldn't. "Do you have any cameras facing the dock?" I swallowed. "I have one facing the backyard, but it doesn't catch the dock itself." Karen smirked like that was some kind of confession. "Convenient," she muttered. The deputy pretended not to hear her. He told us both he'd file the report and forward it to the HOA, who would almost certainly get involved. The phrase, "almost certainly," made my stomach sink a little, because the HOA involving themselves was exactly what I didn't want. It was barely past 8 in the morning, and already the day felt heavier than it needed to be. Karen kept pacing near the truck even after the deputy said he was done, acting like she was waiting for him to suddenly turn around and handcuff me. Meanwhile, I stood there wondering how exactly I was going to explain all this to my wife, who already thought Karen was exhausting. While Karen kept going on about accountability, the deputy finally told her he needed to go check on another call. She tried to keep talking, but he gave her that polite but firm nod cops use when they're ending a conversation. Once he was in his truck, I started walking back toward my house. Karen called out something behind me, something like, "You're not getting away with this," but I didn't look back. As I walked across the yard, the sun was rising higher over the lake, and from where I stood I could still see the golf cart drifting, sinking inch by inch, the roof barely above water now. And even though none of this was technically my fault, I had the strangest feeling that this morning was only the beginning of something much bigger than a golf cart in the lake. By the time I got back inside, my wife, Emily, was standing by the sliding glass door with her coffee mug in both hands, staring out at the lake the same way people stare at a traffic accident they can't fully see but know is bad. She didn't say anything at first. She just raised her eyebrows in that resigned way that meant she heard enough to guess this was going to be one of those days. I poured myself a mug of coffee, trying to ignore the faint vibration of my phone buzzing with text notifications. I already knew one of them would be from the HOA group thread because whenever something even remotely dramatic happens, someone is already typing about it before the dust settles. Emily finally asked what had happened. I told her the short version, which still felt too long. She sat down at the small kitchen table, rubbing her forehead. She has never been a morning person, and dealing with neighbor drama before breakfast definitely wasn't how she wanted to start her day. "So she filed a report?" she asked. I nodded. "He filed one for both of us." "Great," she said, stirring her coffee with a spoon even though she didn't put anything in it. "The HOA's going to grab onto this like it's the Super Bowl." I took a sip of coffee and looked out the window again. The cart wasn't visible anymore, which made the lake look calmer than it had any right to be after all that. Emily kept asking questions. How the cart got into the water, whether the deputy thought I did it, whether Karen had said anything particularly ridiculous. I answered everything as simply as possible, trying not to sound frustrated even though I was. I told her about the deputy asking about cameras. She said maybe we really should angle one toward the dock now. Not to catch anything dramatic, but just to avoid any more nonsense in the future. After about 10 minutes of trying to decompress, my phone buzzed again, and I finally checked the screen. It was, unsurprisingly, the HOA group thread. There were already 27 unread messages. The board president, a retired guy named Dave who talked about bylaws like they were ancient scripture, had posted something about a significant property concern on Lakeshore Drive and urged residents not to speculate until the facts were clear. That, of course, only made people speculate harder. Most of the messages were neighbors asking what happened, a couple of them already assuming the worst. One message from someone I barely knew asked whether lake pollution was a risk with foreign machinery sinking in public waters. That phrasing alone made me rub my temple. Nothing on this lake was public, everyone knew that. But people always act like anything visible from their deck automatically belongs to them. Before I could even start typing a vague response, there was a knock at the door. Not the polite two-tap kind either. It was 3 sharp knocks, the kind people use when they want to be sure you know they're annoyed. Emily and I exchanged a look, and I already knew who it was. I opened the door and found Karen standing there with damp grass stuck to the soles of her sandals, her hair frizzing slightly from the moisture in the air. She didn't wait for an invitation. She just started talking. "I need to see your camera footage," she said, arms crossed. "Whatever points toward the backyard or dock." "Good morning to you too," I said reflexively, but she didn't appreciate the attempt at civility. She took a step closer to the doorframe. "The deputy said it might help determine who pushed my golf cart into the lake." "He asked if I had cameras," I said. "He didn't tell me to hand anything over." "Don't be difficult," she said, and the way she said it made my jaw tighten. "If you didn't do anything, then you shouldn't have a problem showing me the footage." "Even if I showed it to you," I said, "it won't include the dock. The angle is too wide, and the trees block most of the lower yard." She stared at me like I was withholding some magical piece of evidence. I reminded her that she was the one who parked the cart on my property in the first place. She waved that off immediately, saying she only parked there because her driveway had been resealed and she needed a flat spot that wouldn't damage the new coating. I resisted the urge to point out the obvious. She had a perfectly usable patch of yard she could have parked on if she actually cared about staying off my property. But arguing about that with her was like arguing with a wall that occasionally shouted back. Emily stepped into the doorway behind me, offering Karen a tight smile. Karen softened her tone slightly, but even that looked like it physically pained her. "Look," she said, "I'm not trying to make this a bigger deal than it is. I just need to know what happened." Emily, who is much better at sounding reasonable than I am, asked, "Are you sure the parking brake was on last night?" Karen bristled. "Of course it was. I'm not incompetent." "It's possible it wasn't fully engaged," I said. Those carts roll easier than people think. She looked between us, her lips tightening. You're implying I caused this, she said. I didn't. And I'm not taking the fall for something someone else did. I didn't have the energy to keep going in circles with her. I told her she could ask the HOA to request footage formally if they deemed it necessary. That way it wouldn't be me handing anything over, it would be part of an official process. Karen stared at me for a long moment, like she was trying to decide whether to keep arguing or storm off dramatically. She chose neither. Instead, she muttered something about checking the shoreline for footprints and walked away without saying goodbye. I closed the door slowly. Emily exhaled like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. This isn't going away, she said. No, I agreed. It's not. I finished my coffee and went outside to clean up around the dock, mostly because pacing aimlessly inside wasn't helping. The morning was getting warmer, and the humidity was rising the way it always does before noon. I checked the kayak shed again, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted to reassure myself that nothing else had been touched. Everything looked normal. The shed still smelled like cedar and lake water, and the faint buzz of insects was growing louder as the sun climbed higher. I walked along the dock slowly, scanning the boards. There were no drag marks, no scratches, nothing that suggested someone had forcibly moved a heavy cart across it. If anything, the grass next to the dock slope looked like it had been pressed down in a way that could support the rolling theory, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. A few neighbors had started wandering outside by then, drawn to the gossip like moths to a porch light. One of them, Mark, ambled down the hill toward me with his hands in his pockets. He's a laid-back guy, one of the few who doesn't care about HOA drama unless it affects fishing hours or boat launches. He asked if everything was okay. I told him the short version, which again felt too long. He squinted at the lake where the cart had been. Could have rolled, he said. I've had mine slip downhill a couple times when the brake wasn't all the way up. It felt validating, but I also didn't want to rely on anecdotal neighbor physics. Karen's convinced someone pushed it, I said. Mark shrugged. Karen's convinced of a lot of things. He scratched his chin and asked if I thought the HOA would make this a big deal. I told him it was already halfway to becoming one. He shook his head slowly like he was disappointed but not surprised. The rest of the afternoon passed in that slow, uneasy way that happens when you know something's brewing but you can't do anything to stop it. I tried to mow the upper yard to distract myself, but every time I passed the shoreline I found myself glancing at the water, imagining the cart resting on the lakebed like a relic from some modern-age shipwreck. By late afternoon, an email from the HOA showed up. It said there would be an emergency discussion session the next evening in the community center regarding property boundaries and shared space protocols. It didn't say my name, but it didn't need to. Everyone would know exactly what it was about. I showed the email to Emily. She groaned, leaning her head back against the chair. They're going to grill you like you're on trial, she said. They'll grill both of us, I said. But we didn't do anything wrong. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't reassured. Neither was I. As the sun dipped lower and the lake shifted from blue to that kind of shimmering gold, I had this heavy feeling in my stomach. Not guilt, not fear, just the awareness that this stupid golf cart had already grown into something much bigger than it needed to be. And I wasn't naive. I knew that by tomorrow evening, when the HOA gathered and everyone pretended to be civil while quietly choosing sides, things would escalate. Not because of the cart itself, but because of everything it represented to people like Karen: control, territory, pride. I could already feel the tension humming in the neighborhood like distant electricity, building quietly toward something I couldn't yet see. The next day felt strangely calm at first, the kind of calm that tricks you into thinking maybe the storm passed overnight, only to remind you later that it was just gathering strength. I spent the morning trying to keep to my routine: coffee on the deck, answering a few work emails, and checking the weather to see if the weekend would be good for fishing. Everything looked normal at a distance, but every so often I'd catch sight of a neighbor walking their dog a little too slowly near our property line, or someone kayaking by with a lingering look toward the dock, and it was obvious the story had already spread farther than any of us wanted. I wasn't surprised. A golf cart sinking in the lake isn't the kind of thing a neighborhood forgets quickly. Around mid-morning, I decided to walk down to the dock again, not because I expected to find anything new but because I felt restless. The boards were dry this time, warmed by the sun, and the water below had that glassy quality it gets when there isn't even a hint of wind. For a moment it was easy to imagine none of this had happened, but then I saw the faint discoloration in the water where the cart had settled the night before, just a darker patch near the bottom. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight difference in tone, but it was enough to remind me why I'd been feeling uneasy since yesterday. As I stood there, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Dave, the HOA president, walking down the slope with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Dave was the kind of guy who treated retirement like a full-time job, and the HOA board was his version of an elected office. He had a habit of writing things down as people talked, not because he needed the notes but because it made him feel official. He offered a polite nod and said he'd heard about the incident. I resisted the urge to ask if he'd heard about it before or after Karen had rewritten the entire story to suit her version of events. Instead, I just nodded and waited for him to say whatever he'd come to say. He asked if he could inspect the area, which made the situation feel unnecessarily formal. I stepped aside, and he walked slowly along the dock, scanning the boards like a detective looking for clues in a crime scene. I found myself watching him, trying to figure out what he thought he was going to find. After a minute he asked if I had any idea how the cart ended up in the water. I repeated what I'd said yesterday, that I didn't know, that I hadn't touched it, that all I did was find it drifting. He wrote something down, which annoyed me more than it should have. Then he started asking about property lines, specifically whether I had a current survey. I told him I had one from when we bought the house, and nothing about the shoreline had changed since then. He nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pen against the clipboard. Something about the way he did it made me nervous, not because I had anything to hide but because people sometimes twist neutral facts into convenient narrative. He cleared his throat and told me that tonight's meeting wouldn't be disciplinary but rather informational, which was HOA speak for, we're going to make this as uncomfortable as possible while pretending we're being neutral. I asked whether Karen had told him she parked the cart on my property without permission. He hesitated just long enough to make me suspect the answer. Then he said he couldn't comment on ongoing discussions, which told me everything I needed to know. As he walked back up the slope, I felt this heavy irritation settling into my shoulders. HOA politics always brought out the worst in people, but this time it felt personal. Not because of the cart itself, but because Karen had a way of spinning things so that she always felt like the victim, even when she'd caused the problem. The rest of the afternoon was a countdown to the meeting. Emily tried to distract herself by baking, which she only did when she was anxious. The smell of cinnamon filled the house, and she kept wiping down the counter even though there was nothing on it. I tried to read for a while, but my brain wouldn't focus. Instead, I kept replaying yesterday's conversation with the deputy and imagining all the ways tonight could go wrong. Around 5, there was another knock at the door, softer this time. When I opened it, I found our neighbor across the cove, an older guy named Frank, standing there. He's a retired engineer with a talent for fixing anything mechanical. He said he heard about the golf cart and wondered if we needed help pulling it out of the lake. I appreciated the offer more than he probably realized. We talked for a few minutes about how deep the lake was in that spot, whether the mud would make retrieval difficult, and what tools might help. It felt good to have a normal conversation with someone who wasn't treating the situation like a scandal. When he left, Emily said it was nice of him. I agreed. But the meeting was still on my mind like an unwelcome appointment. By the time 6:30 rolled around, we were walking into the community center. It's a small building, more like a large shed with nice lighting, and every time the HOA holds something there, the folding chairs always seem slightly off balance. When we walked in, half the seats were already filled. People were chatting quietly, some pretending not to look at us and some not bothering to pretend. Karen was in the front row, of course, sitting with her arms folded so tightly across her chest that it looked uncomfortable. She didn't look back at us, but I could tell she knew we had arrived. Dave called the meeting to order a few minutes later, tapping the edge of his clipboard like a judge calling for quiet. He started with a summary of why we were here, phrased in the blandest possible corporate tone. A neighboring property vehicle incident. A review of shoreline usage guidelines. A clarification of parking rules. It all sounded so sanitized that I almost laughed. Then he invited Karen to speak first, which irritated me but didn't surprise me. She stood up slowly like she was stepping onto a stage. She spoke calmly at first, describing how she had temporarily positioned her cart near the dock due to driveway maintenance, how she trusted that neighbors would respect each other's needs, and how she discovered her property damaged beyond use. She didn't accuse me outright, but she implied enough. Every sentence had this passive-aggressive undertone, the kind that lets the speaker appear reasonable while still pointing a finger. When it was my turn, I tried to keep my voice even. I explained that she had parked on my property without permission, that I found the cart drifting in the lake the next morning, and that I had no involvement in its movement. I told them about the slope and how easily carts could roll if the brake wasn't fully set. A couple of people nodded. A couple frowned. A couple stared at the floor like they'd rather be anywhere else. Dave asked if either of us had evidence. I said no. Karen said no but added that she suspected tampering, because nothing like this has ever happened before. That line stung because she made it sound like I had some history of petty sabotage. I reminded the room that I'd asked her several times not to store things on my property. She countered that she thought we had an understanding. I almost laughed, but I didn't. The discussion went back and forth longer than it needed to, and at some point it became less about the cart and more about every small tension that had built up in the neighborhood over the last year. People mentioned boats tied too long to shared docks, noisy yard work, the time Mark accidentally left his kayak on someone's grass. It was like the golf cart had opened a floodgate. Eventually, Dave tried to wrap things up by proposing a new rule: no parking or storing anything within 10 feet of someone else's dock. It was a reasonable rule, and I agreed. Karen didn't. She argued that lake access should be collaborative, whatever that meant. By the end, nothing had been resolved about the cart itself. The room emptied slowly, people whispering to each other as they left. Emily and I walked out quietly. As we reached the parking lot, she asked how I felt. I didn't answer immediately. I was thinking about something Dave had said near the end, about how the HOA might need to investigate further if tensions continued. It didn't sound like a threat exactly, but it didn't sound casual either. And as we drove home with the community center fading into the dusk, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real conflict hadn't even started yet. The morning after the HOA meeting felt heavier than usual, like the air itself had absorbed the tension from the night before. I woke up earlier than I meant to, partly because I didn't sleep well and partly because the house felt too quiet. Emily was still asleep, curled on her side with the blanket pulled up to her chin, and I didn't want to wake her. I slipped out of bed, made coffee, and stepped onto the deck. The lake was covered in a thin sheet of mist that lifted slowly in the sunlight, giving everything a muted, almost dreamlike look. For a moment, if I ignored the tightness in my stomach, everything looked perfectly normal. I sipped my coffee and tried to convince myself that maybe the meeting had been the peak of the drama, that maybe things would settle now that the HOA had at least addressed the issue. But the more I thought about Dave's vague comment about investigating further, the less optimistic I felt. Just as I started to relax into the morning, I noticed movement near the shoreline. At first I thought it was ducks, but then I saw a person, someone crouched near the slope, partly hidden by the trees. It took me a few seconds to realize it was Karen. She was wearing a hoodie and leggings, her posture stiff and tense like she was hunting for clues. She kept scanning the ground, brushing her hands over the grass as if she expected to find footprints or drag marks that had magically preserved themselves for 2 days. I watched her from the deck for a while, not sure whether approaching her would help or make things worse. After a minute, she stood up and started walking slowly along the shoreline toward my dock. She wasn't trespassing yet, technically. Her yard ran down close to mine before the boundary line curved inward, but she was close enough that it made me uneasy. I took a long breath and walked down the stairs to meet her halfway. "Morning," I said when I got close enough. She looked startled, then immediately guarded. "I'm checking for evidence," she said without saying hello, still looking at the ground instead of me. There could be tire marks, footprints, something showing how the cart moved. "It rained last night," I reminded her, gesturing to the wet ground. "Anything that was here is gone now." She paused, frustrated by the logic but unwilling to concede. "Something happened," she said quietly. "It didn't just go." This time her voice wasn't sharp, it sounded genuinely tired. I wasn't sure if she expected me to comfort her or apologize for something I didn't do, so I kept my voice neutral. "I get that this feels personal," I said. "But sometimes things really do happen without anyone intending them." She finally looked at me, her expression difficult to read. There was anger in it, but also something like embarrassment. "Dave thinks someone might have messed with it," she said. "He didn't say who, but he hinted that there could be consequences if I don't push for a follow-up." "Consequences for who?" I asked. She shrugged. "Whoever's responsible." The implication hung there like fog, unspoken but obvious. I told her again that I didn't push her cart. She didn't argue directly, but she didn't accept it either. She started walking back toward her yard, muttering to herself, and I watched her go with that same mix of frustration and confusion I always felt after talking to her. It was like she was stuck between wanting someone to blame and knowing deep down the mistake might have been hers. After she disappeared into her backyard, I checked the slope myself. Not because I expected to see anything new, but because I didn't want her coming back later and claiming she found something that didn't exist. The ground was smooth from the rain, and the only footprints were hers and the faint impressions from deer that wander through the neighborhood at night. There was nothing that pointed to anyone pushing anything anywhere. I walked back to the house, feeling that uncomfortable restlessness creeping in again, and found Emily in the kitchen. She had tired eyes but was awake enough to register the look on my face. "What now?" she asked. I told her about Karen inspecting the shoreline. She sighed, rubbing her forehead. "She's spiraling," she said. "And she's going to drag everyone with her." She wasn't wrong. By late morning, an email from Dave arrived saying the HOA board would be conducting individual follow-up conversations to compile a full understanding of the incident. The wording felt like something out of an HR manual. Emily read it over my shoulder and whispered, "They're turning this into a full investigation." I nodded, already knowing that was exactly what was happening. Around noon, I got a call from Frank, the retired engineer who'd offered to help retrieve the cart. He said he'd borrowed a small winch from another neighbor and wanted to meet by the shoreline in an hour to see if we could pull the cart out. I thanked him and said I'd be there. Emily decided to join us, mostly because she didn't like the idea of me being down at the water with Karen potentially watching from her deck like an over-caffeinated hawk. When we got down there, Frank was already setting things up. He'd brought a small metal tripod anchored into the ground, a hand crank, and some sturdy rope. He looked like he was preparing for a fishing expedition that required engineering credentials. The process took longer than we expected. The rope had to be maneuvered around the cart's frame, and Frank had to stand knee-deep in the water to get the angle right. The lake was cold this time of year, and he winced every time he stepped on a rock. I held the tripod steady, Emily passed him tools, and the three of us worked together in a slow, methodical rhythm. At one point I noticed Karen watching from her deck, arms crossed, body stiff. She didn't say anything and didn't come down to help, just observed like she was monitoring the recovery of stolen property. After about 40 minutes of cranking, shifting, and adjusting, the top of the golf cart finally broke the surface. Mud clung to the tires, and lake weeds draped over the steering wheel like seaweed on a wreck. It looked worse than I expected, not in a dramatic way but in that sad, quiet way things look when they've been ruined by something dumb and avoidable. We dragged it onto the slope and propped it on blocks to let the water drain. Frank inspected the frame and wiring, mumbling technical things under his breath. Finally he straightened up and wiped his hands on his shorts. "Brake wasn't fully set," he said simply. Emily and I looked at each other. Frank tapped the rear wheel with his foot. "See the angle? If someone parked it with the brake half engaged, it would hold at first, but the slightest shift, rain, wind, even temperature change, could make it roll." He pointed to the grass, where a faint but clear downward path lined up perfectly with the lake. "It rolled," he said. "Nothing else explains it." I felt something ease in my chest, validation more than relief. But before I could even thank him, Karen came walking down the hill in abrupt, purposeful step. "What are you doing to it?" she asked, breathless. Frank explained calmly. She interrupted him halfway through. "That's not possible," she said. "I set the brake." Frank shrugged. "Maybe you thought you did, but these brakes are touchy." She shook her head. "Someone messed with it." Frank exchanged a quick glance with me, then said gently that he didn't see any signs of tampering. Karen stood there for several seconds, her jaw tight, her eyes darting between the cart, the lake, and the three of us. You could see the conflict on her face, logic pushing one way, pride pushing the other. Finally she muttered, "I need to talk to Dave," and walked back up the hill without another word. Frank exhaled dramatically once she was gone. "She's not going to let this go," he said quietly. Emily squeezed my arm. "She can't fight physics forever." Maybe not, I thought, but she could fight long enough to make everyone miserable. As we packed up the tools and walked back toward the house, I kept replaying Karen's expression, confusion, denial, and something else I couldn't quite place. And even though we now had a perfectly logical explanation for what happened, I knew her narrative wasn't going to change easily. Pride has a way of rewriting facts until they fit. And something told me that instead of ending the conflict, pulling the cart out of the lake. Over the next 2 days the atmosphere in the neighborhood tightened in a way that was hard to describe but impossible to ignore. Neighbors acted polite but overly careful, like everyone was waiting to see which way the wind would blow before taking a side. The golf cart, propped on blocks beside Karen's garage, looked like a wounded animal she refused to put out of its misery. Every time I walked past my front window, I'd catch her standing next to it with her arms crossed, staring at the frame as if she expected it to confess something. I tried focusing on work, but my phone kept lighting up with messages from neighbors asking for clarification, HOA emails about ongoing evaluation, and one awkward text from Dave asking if I'd be comfortable answering a few more questions. Emily said I should ignore him unless he asked formally, but she also admitted that the whole situation was starting to feel like we were being watched. On the third morning, I stepped outside and found a small stack of printed letters rubber-banded to our mailbox, HOA incident documentation forms, each one a generic questionnaire asking about observations, possible suspicions, and relevant recollections. I stood there in my driveway with the stack in my hand, feeling like the neighborhood had turned into a poorly funded detective show. Emily walked out a minute later, saw my expression, and muttered, "Oh, for God's sake," under her breath. She grabbed one of the forms and skimmed it. "They're fishing," she said. "They don't have anything, so they're trying to compile enough vague statements to make it look like they're doing something." I nodded but didn't speak. Part of me wanted to fill them out with blunt answers. Another part of me wanted to drop them straight into the recycling bin. Before I could decide, my phone buzzed with a call from Frank. He apologized for bothering me early, but said he thought I should know something. He'd gotten a visit from Dave the evening before. Apparently the HOA was asking residents if they'd noticed tensions between me and Karen. I told him you've always been a good neighbor, Frank said. But he seemed invested. I appreciated the heads-up, though hearing it made my stomach tighten. After I hung up, Emily squeezed my hand. They're building a narrative, she said. But they're doing it backwards. They're starting with a conclusion and looking for facts to match it. She was right. And if that was what the HOA was doing, it wasn't going to stop on its own. Around noon, I stepped outside to grab a package from the porch. As I was turning to go back inside, I saw Karen walking briskly across her yard, holding something in her hand. A phone or a piece of paper, I couldn't tell. She stopped halfway to my property line and called out, "We need to talk." Her tone wasn't aggressive this time. It was tense, clipped, like she had rehearsed something and was determined to get through it. I walked toward her slowly, stopping at the clear boundary where our lawns met. She held up her phone. On the screen was a picture, one clearly taken from a distance. It showed the golf cart halfway submerged, exactly as I found it, but the angle made it look like it was directly behind my dock, almost as if it had been pushed from that direction. "Someone sent this to me anonymously," she said. Her voice shook slightly, though not from sadness, more from the pressure of wanting this to be a smoking gun. I studied the photo carefully. The timestamp was blurred. The angle was misleading. And the person who'd sent it, if the claim was true, had picked a vantage point from across the lake that distorted everything. "This doesn't show anything," I said calmly. "It just shows the cart in the water." "It shows where it sank," she said. "Right behind your dock. Because that's where the slope leads." She looked away briefly, frustrated. "You're not hearing me," she said. "I know what it looks like. You know what it looks like. And the HOA knows what it looks like." A flicker of something, fear, maybe, crossed her face before she masked it. "I'm not saying you did it," she continued, "but people are asking questions. Dave wants to know if I want to escalate this beyond the HOA. To insurance. Or even civil claims." "Civil claims based on what?" I asked, incredulous. "Based on the fact that my property was damaged while on your land," she said. "Intent doesn't even matter for some claims." I stared at her, trying to process whether she was serious or bluffing. Her jaw was tight, her shoulders rigid, her hands fidgeting with the phone. She wasn't bluffing, not exactly. She was scared and trying to regain control by overreacting. I chose my words carefully. "We both know the break wasn't fully set," I said. "You saw the slope. You heard Frank explain it." She flinched, an involuntary twitch she tried to cover by shifting her weight. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said quietly. "I didn't cause this." "Backing down doesn't make you wrong," I said. "It makes you reasonable." Her eyes flicked up to mine, glassy with defensiveness. For a moment she looked like she might admit something, or at least soften. But then she swallowed hard and said, "I'm going to let the HOA handle it." That phrase, "let them handle it," landed heavier than it should have. She turned and walked away without looking back. I returned to the house feeling that same restless dread that had been growing for days. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from tired to concerned to something bordering on anger. "She's spiraling," Emily said again. "And spiraling people look for anchors, even if it means tying them around someone else's neck." I tried to focus on other things, yard work, work calls, small errands, but the feeling lingered. By late afternoon, another HOA email arrived. A mandatory closed-door session, 4 involved parties, the following evening. It was phrased politely, but the subtext was clear. Emily read it over my shoulder. "They're cornering us," she whispered. "Or trying to." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the HOA board sitting around a table, nodding solemnly at Karen while scribbling notes about liability, negligence, or property damage. I imagined their version of events crystallizing, while mine got diluted into background noise. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I got up and walked out to the deck. The lake was black and mirror-like. The night air was cool and still. Everything looked peaceful in a way that felt almost mocking. As I stood there, I heard faint footsteps on the gravel path behind the house. My first thought was raccoon. My second was deer. But when I turned toward the sound, I saw a small beam of light flickering near the shoreline, someone walking the edge of the water with a flashlight. It took me a second to recognize the silhouette. Karen. Again. She was sweeping the flashlight back and forth across the slope, as if hoping that in the middle of the night she'd find something she'd missed in daylight, a clue, a tire mark, anything to absolve her of responsibility. I didn't go down. I didn't call out to her. I just watched from the deck as she paced, searching for a reality that matched the one she'd built in her head. She stayed there for almost 10 minutes before finally turning back toward her house, the flashlight beam trembling slightly. When she was gone, I exhaled slowly. That was the moment I realized the situation wasn't just frustrating or inconvenient, it was unstable. And when unstable people mix with HLA politics, things tend to get worse before they get better. As I went back inside and lay in bed next to Emily, I understood something. Tomorrow's meeting wasn't going to be the end of this. It was going to be the breaking point. The following evening, just before the mandatory HOA session, the sky shifted into that strange, grayish-orange color it gets before a storm. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath along with the neighborhood. Emily and I walked toward the community center together, saying little. Cars were already lined along the curb, headlights reflecting off the damp pavement. The building's windows glowed faintly, and through them I could see silhouettes shifting, gathering, settling into chairs. It felt less like a meeting and more like stepping into a waiting room before a medical procedure, one where everyone already suspects the diagnosis but doesn't want to be the first to say it out loud. Inside, the board members sat at the front in a row like a panel of judges. Dave sat in the center with his clipboard, flanked by 2 others. Linda, who always took notes even when nothing was happening, and a newer board member named Kyle, who seemed too young to be as serious as he tried to look. There were only a few chairs set out for the rest of us. One for me, one for Emily, and one for Karen, who sat rigidly with her spine perfectly straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her expression was a mix of exhaustion and pressure, as if she had convinced herself that tonight was her last chance at reclaiming something she felt she'd lost along the way, control, dignity, or maybe just the belief that she hadn't caused her own problem. As soon as the door closed behind us, Dave cleared his throat in a dramatic way that suggested he'd been practicing. "Thank you for coming," he said, folding his hands on the table. "This session is to finalize our understanding of the recent shoreline incident." He paused as if waiting for applause. None came. He continued anyway. "We have gathered statements from neighbors and reviewed available observations." Observations. I muttered under my breath, but Emily rested her hand on my knee to keep me quiet. "At this time," Dave went on, "we'd like to give both parties the chance to make a final statement before we determine any necessary action." He gestured toward Karen. She stood slowly, smoothing her shirt with trembling hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer than I expected. "I want to be clear," she began, "that this situation has been extremely upsetting for me." She glanced down as she spoke, picking imaginary lint off the hem of her shirt. "My golf cart was damaged. It was important to me. And I felt like maybe someone wasn't being honest about what happened." She didn't look directly at me, but her words hung in the air between us. "I believed," she continued, "that there was a possibility someone pushed it. I know that sounds dramatic, but it was hard not to feel that way when it ended up so far out in the water." She paused. Her voice cracked, not in a theatrical way, but in a genuinely tired one. "And I didn't want to be blamed for something I didn't think I did." Dave gave her a sympathetic nod and motioned for her to sit. Then he looked at me. I stood up and took a breath, steadying myself. "I understand why Karen was upset," I said. If my property ended up in the lake, I'd want answers too. But I didn't push her cart. And I didn't tamper with it. I've said that from the beginning. Frank explained the slope. The brake situation. It was an accident. A simple, avoidable accident. I tried not to sound accusatory, just factual. I'm not angry that the cart rolled. I'm frustrated that this turned into something bigger than it needed to be. I paused, glancing at Karen, who finally met my eyes. There was no glare this time, just something tired, worn down. I don't want this to be a feud, I said. I just want us to go back to being neighbors, not adversaries. Emily nodded subtly beside me, and I sat back down. Dave exhaled dramatically, then opened the folder in front of him with the slow ceremony of someone about to read a verdict. Thank you, he said. We've reviewed all collected information. There is no evidence of foul play. There is no evidence of tampering. The angle of the slope, mechanical condition of the cart, and testimony from multiple residents strongly support the conclusion that the parking brake was not fully set. Karen's shoulders stiffened, but she remained silent. Dave continued, this was an accident. An unfortunate one, but an accident. He folded his hands again. However, the board does feel the situation escalated in a way that was avoidable, and we are implementing a clear new rule. No vehicles or personal property may be parked within 10 feet of any neighbor's dock or shoreline access without written consent. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me came next. Given the tension that resulted, Dave said carefully, we recommend that both parties avoid direct confrontation for the next 30 days and route all shoreline concerns through the board if needed. I bit back a laugh. 30 days of enforced civility, like a neighborhood timeout. Karen looked like she didn't know whether to cry or argue. Additionally, Dave added, we encourage you both to resolve any remaining misunderstandings privately, when ready. That sounded like the HOA's way of saying they were done being referees. Kyle chimed in for the first time, his voice too formal for someone wearing boat shoes. Neither party will face disciplinary action. I saw Karen blink several times, processing. That had probably been her biggest fear, that she'd somehow get cited, fined, or blamed for escalating the issue. Dave adjourned the meeting with a curt nod, and everyone stood in a slow, awkward shuffle. Emily squeezed my hand, relieved but drained. Karen lingered by the door, gripping her phone tightly. For a moment she looked like she might walk out without saying anything. But then she turned slightly toward us. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, she said quietly, voice trembling just enough to suggest honesty. I just panicked. I didn't want this to look like my fault. Her eyes were red, not from crying but from days of pressure. I nodded. I get it, I said. Really? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her voice soft when she finally spoke. I set the brake halfway. I didn't realize. The confession wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just real, tired and small, like a truth that had finally stopped fighting to stay buried. It happens, I said gently. No harm meant. No harm taken. She nodded once, tightly, and left the room. Emily and I walked out after her, stepping into the cool night air. The storm clouds had mostly passed, leaving the sky smeared with streaks of fading orange and soft purple. It felt like the weather itself had exhaled. As we walked home, Emily wrapped her arm through mine. That could have gone worse, she said. Much worse. I nodded. I think it's over now. Probably, she said. At least the worst part. But as we walked down the quiet street, hearing only the distant chirping of crickets and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore, I felt something else settle into place, a kind of acceptance. Neighbors don't have to like each other. They just have to coexist. And sometimes coexistence means weathering storms you didn't ask for, dealing with misunderstandings you didn't cause, and resisting the urge to escalate things just because someone else is spiraling. In the end, the lake was calm again. The dock was exactly where it had always been. The golf cart would eventually dry out or be replaced. and life, predictably and quietly, moved back to normal. Not perfect, not friendly, but steady. And sometimes that's all neighbor peace really needs to be.